The Missouri River lay behind her now, a brown ribbon growing smaller with each turn of the wagon wheels. Clara Matthews pressed a worn handkerchief to her lips, tasting the dust that rose in clouds from the rutted trail. 3 months had passed since she'd stood at Thomas's grave in St. Louis, the spring rain mixing with her tears as she'd whispered goodbye to the man who'd promised her forever, but gave her only 2 years. The wagon lurched over a rock, jolting her from her memories. Around her, the landscape had changed from the gentle hills of Missouri to something vast and unforgiving. Wyoming territory stretched endlessly before her, an ocean of golden grass rippling in the wind, broken only by outcroppings of red rock that jutted from the earth like ancient bones. The sky seemed impossibly wide here, a dome of crystalline blue that made her feel small and exposed. "Ma'am, we'll be stopping at Fort Laramie come nightfall," the driver called back to her. Jim Hutchins was a weathered man of 50, his face carved by wind and sun into deep grooves. He'd agreed to take her as far as the settlement near the Bighorn Mountains for half the usual fare when she'd told him she was a nurse. "Might want to stretch your legs proper before we push on tomorrow." Clara nodded, though he couldn't see her from his perch. She'd learned to save her words out here, where the wind could snatch them away before they reached their intended ears. Her medical supplies rattled in the wooden box beside her, bottles of laudanum, rolls of clean bandages, surgical instruments wrapped in oilcloth, everything she owned in the world, save for the few dresses and her mother's Bible packed in her traveling trunk. The sun had begun its descent toward the mountains when she heard it, a sound that made her heart constrict, a child's cry, high and pained, carried on the wind from somewhere off the trail. "Mr. Hutchins," she called, already gathering her medical bag. "Stop the wagon." "Ma'am, we can't be—" "Stop the wagon!" The authority in her voice surprised them both. It was the voice she'd found in the war hospitals, when doctors tried to push her aside, the voice that had saved lives. Hutchins pulled the reins, and before the wheels had fully stopped, Clara was climbing down, her boots hitting the hard-packed earth with determination. She followed the sound across a shallow ravine, her skirts catching on sagebrush, until she found them, a Mexican family huddled around a boy of perhaps 8 years, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Please," the mother said in accented English, tears streaming down her face. "Please help." Clara was already kneeling, her hands gentle as she examined the break. "It's all right," she murmured, switching to the Spanish she'd learned from the Sisters of Mercy. "I'm a nurse. I can help." The boy whimpered as she carefully straightened the leg, but his dark eyes stayed fixed on her face with trust that made her chest tight. She worked quickly, fashioning a splint from branches and strips torn from her own petticoat, binding it tight while the father held his son still. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "Keep him still for 6 weeks. Change the bandages every 3 days." She pressed a small bottle of laudanum into the mother's hands. "For the pain, just 3 drops in water, no more." The family's gratitude was overwhelming. Blessed Virgin this and Santa Clara that, but Clara waved it away. She was already calculating how much laudanum she had left, how far it would need to stretch in this harsh land. It was nearly dark when she returned to find Hutchins standing by the wagon, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. "That was a fool thing to do," he said gruffly. "Could have been a trap. Could have been anyone out there." But his eyes were softer as he helped her back into the wagon, and she caught him glancing at her with something like respect. They made Fort Laramie as full darkness fell, the fort's walls rising like a promise of safety against the star-filled sky. Clara slept fitfully in the traveler's quarters, her dreams full of Thomas's face and the sound of that child's cry mixing together until she couldn't tell which memory was which. The next morning brought a change in the air, a sharpness that spoke of snow in the high country. Though it was still early September, as they prepared to leave, a group of soldiers lounged near the gate, their conversation carrying clearly in the still air. "Heard tell there's still some Cheyenne up in the mountains," one said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Savages that wouldn't come into the reservation. Army should have finished the job at Sand Creek," another replied. "Can't trust a one of 'em." Clara's hands stilled on her trunk. She'd heard of Sand Creek, whispered stories in the hospitals of women and children slaughtered. The soldiers who'd done it had been called heroes by some, butchers by others. "Ma'am." Hutchins appeared at her elbow. "Best we get moving." 3 days later, they reached the settlement, if it could be called that. A handful of buildings clustered against the feet of the Bighorn Mountains like sheep seeking shelter. The largest was Garrison's trading post, which doubled as a tavern and the closest thing to civilization for 100 miles in any direction. Clara stood in the dusty street, her trunk and medical supplies stacked beside her, watching Hutchins' wagon disappear back the way they'd come. The mountains loomed above her, their peaks already touched with snow, and she felt the full weight of her decision. "You, the nurse?" She turned to find a woman watching her from the doorway of the trading post. Martha Garrison, as she introduced herself, was built like a fence post and twice as sturdy, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. "I am," Clara said. "Clara Matthews. I was hoping to find work. Can you deal with gunshot wounds, knife fights, birthing babies when the nearest doctor's a week's ride away? I spent 2 years in the war hospitals. I can deal with whatever needs dealing with." Martha's face cracked into what might have been a smile. "Then you'll do. Room and board plus $2 a week, and you help me with the trading post when you're not doctoring. Take it or leave it." Clara took it. That evening, as she arranged her few belongings in the small room above the trading post, she stood at the window looking out at the vast landscape. The setting sun painted the grasslands gold and crimson, and the mountains threw long shadows across the valley. It was then she saw him, a lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against the dying light. Even from this distance, she could tell he sat his horse differently than the cowboys and soldiers she'd seen. Straighter, more a part of the animal than merely riding it. He was watching the settlement, still as stone, and Clara found herself holding her breath. The figure remained motionless for long minutes, and she had the strangest feeling he was looking directly at her window. Then, as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the mountains, he wheeled his horse and vanished into the gathering darkness like smoke. "Best you stay away from the windows come nightfall," Martha said from the doorway, making Clara jump. "Never know who might be watching." "Who was that?" Martha's face hardened. "One of them that wouldn't come in. Cheyenne. They call him Nash, though that ain't his heathen name. He comes around sometimes, trades pelts for supplies. Don't cause no trouble long as folks leave him be. But—" she shook her head. "Just keep your distance. Nothing good comes from mixing with their kind." But Clara couldn't forget the stillness of that figure, the way he'd seemed to see her across the distance. That night, as coyotes howled in the hills and the wind rattled her window, she dreamed of a rider watching from the shadows. Guardian or threat, she couldn't tell. The West, she was learning, was a land of harsh beauties and harsher truths. And somewhere out there in the darkness, beyond the circle of settlement lights, moved people who'd been here long before her kind had come with their weapons and their wounds and their promises of civilization. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and prepared for whatever tomorrow would bring. She'd come here to escape her ghosts, but perhaps Wyoming held other spirits, ones that moved on horseback through the twilight, carrying their own griefs like shadows across the land. The weeks passed slowly in the settlement, each day bleeding into the next with the rhythm of frontier life. Clara had found her place at Garrison's trading post, her hands staying busy with the endless stream of injuries that seemed to be part of daily existence here. Cowboys with broken bones from horse falls, miners with infected wounds, women worn down by the harsh life and endless childbearing. October arrived with teeth. The temperature plummeted overnight, and Clara woke to find frost etching delicate patterns on her window. She'd been in Wyoming territory for nearly a month now, and the approaching winter filled her with a quiet dread. Martha had warned her that winters here were nothing like those in Missouri. They were killers, pure and simple. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the storm began building. Clara noticed it first as a change in the light. the sun taking on a sickly yellow cast that made everything look diseased. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down like a physical weight. "Storm coming," Martha said, sniffing the air like a hound. "Big one, by the feel of it. Best get everything battened down." They worked together to secure the trading post, bringing in anything that might blow away, checking the shutters, ensuring they had enough wood for the stove. The few customers who'd been lingering over whiskey quickly finished their drinks and headed for their own shelters. By evening, the wind had picked up to a howl. Clara stood at the window watching tumbleweeds race past like fleeing spirits. The mountains had disappeared entirely behind a wall of dust and debris that rose hundreds of feet into the air. "Never seen anything like it," she murmured. "Dust storm," Martha said grimly. "They come through sometimes before the snow, like the earth itself is angry." The first blast hit the trading post with enough force to rattle the entire building. Clara gasped as the windows flexed inward, and dust began seeping through every crack and crevice. Within minutes, the air inside was hazy, tasting of grit and decay. "Get the lamps lit," Martha ordered. "It'll be dark as midnight soon enough." She was right. The storm swallowed the sun whole, plunging them into an eerie twilight. Clara could barely see across the room through the swirling dust. Her eyes burned, and each breath felt like swallowing sand. That's when she heard it, a pounding at the door, barely audible over the shrieking wind. "Don't open it!" Martha shouted, but Clara was already moving. Someone was out there in this hell, and her healer's instincts overrode caution. She struggled with the door, the wind fighting her for control. When it finally gave way, the storm rushed in like a living thing, nearly knocking her off her feet. A figure stumbled through the doorway, and together they fought to close the door against the wind's fury. When Clara turned, wiping dust from her eyes, she found herself face to face with the rider she'd seen that first night, Nash. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of dark honey. His black hair was long, tied back with a leather cord, and his clothes were a mix of traditional buckskin and white man's cloth. Dust covered him like a second skin, but beneath it, she could see the lean strength of someone who lived by necessity rather than choice. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You shouldn't be out in this," she said, having to raise her voice over the storm. "Neither should you be opening doors to strangers," he replied. His English was perfect, with only the slightest accent coloring the words. "Get inside before it's too late." The words hit her like a physical blow. There was something in his voice, urgency, warning, and underneath it all, a protective fierceness that made her stomach tighten. "I am inside," she said, but he was already moving past her, and she realized he meant away from the door, deeper into the building. Martha stood frozen behind the counter, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" "Same as anyone," Nash said calmly. "Seeking shelter from the storm. We don't serve your kind here." "Martha," Clara said sharply. "He's a human being, and there's a storm. We're not turning anyone out in this." The two women locked eyes for a long moment before Martha looked away. "Fine, but he stays where I can see him." Nash settled himself against the far wall, seeming to take up less space than a man his size should. Clara found herself stealing glances at him as she went about lighting more lamps against the unnatural darkness. He sat perfectly still, only his eyes moving as he tracked the movements in the room. The storm raged for hours. The building groaned and creaked under the assault, and at times Clara feared the roof might tear away entirely. She busied herself with small tasks, checking her medical supplies, mending a torn apron, anything to avoid thinking about how close the walls felt with Nash's presence filling the room. "You're the healer," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through a brief lull in the wind. Clara looked up, startled. "I'm a nurse, yes." "You helped the Mexican family. Their boy. How did you—" She stopped herself. Of course he knew. He'd been watching the settlement, watching her. "The child heals well. he continued. They speak of you with gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. No. The word was flat, final. They wouldn't. Martha had retreated to her rooms, leaving them alone in the common area. Clara knew she should follow, knew the impropriety of being alone with any man, let alone one that the entire settlement viewed with suspicion and fear. But something kept her rooted to her chair. Why do you watch the settlement? She asked. Nash was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if seeing something beyond the dust-hazed room. I watch because watching is what keeps you alive out here. I watch because this was our land before your people came with their promises and papers. I watch because... He paused, his eyes finding hers. Because sometimes what you watch watches back. Heat crept up Clara's neck. I saw you, that first night. I know. The simple acknowledgement hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Clara stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air that didn't taste of dust and unspoken things. The storm's passing, Nash said, though to Clara it sounded as fierce as ever. He rose in one fluid motion. I should go. You can't go out in this. Clara protested. It's still... I've ridden through worse. He moved toward the door, then paused. Your kindness to those who need it. Don't let this place steal that from you. Winter's coming, and kindness will be in short supply. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a bang that sounded like finality. Clara rushed to the window but could see nothing through the swirling dust. It was as if the storm had swallowed him whole. Martha appeared at her shoulder. You'd do well to forget you ever saw him. Why? Clara turned to face the older woman. What harm has he done? It ain't about what harm he's done. It's about what harm might come. There's bad blood between his people and ours. Has been since Sand Creek, since Washita River. Men here lost friends in the Indian Wars. They won't take kindly to you showing sympathy to their enemy. The wars are over, Clara said. Martha's laugh was bitter. Wars like that don't end, girl. They just go quiet for a while. That night, as the storm finally began to die, Clara lay in her narrow bed thinking about amber eyes and warnings wrapped in concern. She thought about kindness being in short supply and watching that watches back. Most of all, she thought about the way he'd said, get inside before it's too late, as if he could see some danger she couldn't, as if his warning was about more than just the storm. The dust had settled by morning, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that would take days to clean. Clara went about her duties mechanically, but her mind kept returning to those few hours when the world had shrunk to a single room and two people from different worlds had shared the same air. She didn't see Nash again for 2 weeks, but she felt his presence nonetheless. Sometimes, working in the trading post, she'd get the sensation of being watched and look up to see nothing but empty grassland. Once, she found a bundle of herbs on her windowsill, plants she recognized as useful for treating infection, tied with a strip of buckskin. The settlement continued its daily rhythms, unaware or uncaring of her growing restlessness. But Clara had felt something shift during that storm, some wall inside her beginning to crack. She'd come west to escape her past, but perhaps what she'd really been seeking was a future, one that might exist in the space between two worlds. In the silence after a storm's passing, in the eyes of a man who watched from the shadows and spoke of kindness like it was something precious and rare. November came with the first real snow, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and merciless. Clara had grown accustomed to the rhythm of frontier doctoring, setting bones, delivering babies, treating everything from snake bites to bullet wounds. The people of the settlement had accepted her, if grudgingly at first. And now she was simply Doc Clara to most. It was during this time that the whispers began. Riders coming through brought news from other settlements, from the forts, from the distant reservations where most of the Cheyenne and Arapaho had been forced to settle. The news was never good. Starvation rations, disease, children dying of cold in inadequate shelters. And always, the stories of those who'd refused to go to the reservations, who still lived free in the mountains and were hunted like animals. Bounty hunters. Martha told her one evening as they closed up the trading post. Governments put prices on the heads of any Indians living outside the reservations. $50 for a brave, $25 for a woman or child. Clara's hand stilled on the inventory ledger. That's barbaric. That's survival, Martha countered. Them or us. That's how folks see it. But Clara couldn't accept such simple arithmetic. She'd seen too much death to believe in easy divisions between them and us. The wounded boys in the war hospitals had all looked the same in their pain, whether they wore blue or gray. She'd taken to walking along the banks of the Bighorn River in the late afternoons when her duties were done. The water ran low this time of year, whispering over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. It was there, on a day when the sun hung low and red in the winter sky, that she encountered Nash again. He materialized from the cottonwoods like he was part of them, leading his horse to drink. Clara's heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. "Good afternoon." He looked up, and she saw surprise flicker across his features before his expression settled into careful neutrality. "Miss Matthews." "Clara," she corrected. "Please." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the river filling the space between them with its constant murmur. His horse, a paint with intelligent eyes, whickered softly. "Beautiful evening," Clara ventured, immediately feeling foolish. But Nash looked at the sunset bleeding across the mountains and nodded. "The old ones say when the sky bleeds like this, it remembers." "Remembers what?" "Everything that's been spilled on the earth, every ending." He was quiet for a moment. "Every beginning, too, maybe." Clara moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Tell me about your people. Please, I want to understand." Nash studied her for a long moment, and she had the feeling he was weighing her worthiness for such knowledge. Finally, he sat on a large river rock, gesturing for her to do the same. "We were the Chitsistas," he began, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality. "The people. We followed the buffalo, lived by the old ways. My grandfather remembered when the first white traders came, bringing goods we'd never seen. We thought we could share the land. We thought—" He shook his head. "We thought many things that proved false." "What happened to your family?" His jaw tightened. "Sand Creek. I was 12 winters, out hunting with my father and other men. When we returned," he stopped, his hands clenching. "The soldiers came at dawn. Black Kettle had the American flag flying over his lodge, the flag they'd given him as a sign of peace. Didn't matter. They killed everyone. Women, children, elders. My mother, my sisters." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She'd heard of Sand Creek, but hearing it from someone who'd lived it was different. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring them back." His voice was flat, but she could hear the pain underneath, sharp as broken glass. "After that, some of us fought, others tried for peace. Both paths led to the same place, death or the reservation, which is a slower kind of death. But you're still here, still free." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Free. I'm a ghost, Clara, a remnant of something that used to be. I exist in the spaces between. Not enough of my people left to live the old way. Too much pride to live as the white man's pet Indian." Without thinking, Clara reached out and touched his hand. He went very still, looking down at her pale fingers against his sun-darkened skin. "You're not a ghost," she said softly. "You're the most alive person I've met out here." He turned his hand palm up, catching hers gently. "And you? What ghost do you carry?" Clara found herself telling him about Thomas, about the war, about the long nights in hospitals that smelled of death and chloroform. She told him about the letter that came on a Tuesday, how she'd known before she even opened it. She talked until the sun was gone and the first stars appeared, and Nash listened without interrupting, his hand warm around hers. "He was at Antietam," she finished. "They said he died bravely, but what comfort is that? Dead is dead, whether brave or coward. The dead travel a different path," Nash said. "But grief is for the living." It's how we honor what was lost." They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled around them. Clara knew she should be frightened, alone in the dark with a man the settlement called savage. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. "I should walk you back," Nash said finally. "I know the way. The human dangers aren't the only ones out here. Wolves have been coming down from the mountains, hungry and bold." They walked slowly, Nash leading his horse, neither seeming eager to end this stolen moment. At the edge of the settlement, where lamplight began to push back the darkness, he stopped. "This is unwise," he said. "Being seen with me will bring you trouble. I'm not afraid of trouble." "You should be." His voice was urgent now. "There are men here who would hurt you just for speaking to me. Men who see any kindness toward my people as betrayal." "Then they're fools," Clara said hotly. "Fools with guns and righteous anger are the most dangerous kind." He touched her face gently, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. "Be careful, Clara, please." Then he was gone, melting back into the darkness with his horse, leaving Clara standing at the border between two worlds. She touched her cheek where his fingers had been, feeling marked by something invisible but indelible. Walking back to the trading post, she noticed the looks from the few people still on the street. Had they seen? Did they know? But Clara lifted her chin and met their stares directly. She'd survived war and widowhood and the journey west. She wouldn't be cowed by narrow minds and old hatreds. Still, that night she lay awake thinking about Nash's warnings. The settlement was a powder keg of resentments and fears. And she'd just lit a match. But she thought too about his hand holding hers, about the way he'd said her name like it was something precious, about the pain he carried with such dignity. Through her window, she could see the mountains dark against the stars. Somewhere out there. Nash moved through the night, carrying his ghosts and his grief, and Clara knew with sudden certainty that their paths would cross again, that whatever was beginning between them was as inevitable as the river's flow. The wind picked up, rattling her window pane, and she pulled her quilts higher. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, patience to tend, prejudices to navigate, the constant work of survival. But tonight, she allowed herself to remember the warmth of his hand, the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of loss, the way the sunset had painted the world in shades of ending and beginning. In the distance, a wolf howled, and others answered, their voices threading through the darkness like a lament. Clara closed her eyes and thought of ghosts and the living, of paths that crossed despite all wisdom, of two people finding each other in the vast emptiness of the frontier, two souls marked by loss, reaching toward something that might be healing, might be hope, might be disaster. Time would tell which it would be, but lying there in the darkness, Clara knew she wouldn't turn away from whatever was coming. She'd traveled too far and lost too much to choose safety over the possibility of something real, something true, something worth the risk. The wolves sang on, and she let their wild music carry her toward sleep, toward dreams of amber eyes and sunset conversations, toward a future that beckoned from the spaces between two worlds. The attack came 3 days before Christmas, when snow lay thick on the ground and most folks were thinking more of celebration than violence. Clara was awakened before dawn by the smell of smoke and the sound of horses, too many horses for peaceful visitors. She threw on her wrapper and rushed to the window. In the pre-dawn darkness, flames leaped from somewhere beyond the settlement's edge, painting the snow orange and red. Her heart clenched as she recognized the direction, the bend in the river where a small band of Cheyenne families had made camp, peaceful people who sometimes traded at the post, keeping to themselves and causing no trouble. "Martha," Clara called, already pulling on her boots and coat. "Martha, wake up." The older woman appeared in her doorway, took one look at the glow on the horizon, and her face went grim. "Bounty hunters, stay inside, girl." But Clara was already filling her medical bag, hands moving with practiced efficiency. Bandages, laudanum, surgical instruments. She didn't know what she'd find, but she knew there would be wounded. "You can't go out there," Martha said. "It's not our fight. People are hurt. That makes it my fight." Clara pushed past her and out into the cold. The settlement was stirring. Men emerging from buildings with that careful alertness of those who'd survived by knowing when to fight and when to hide. Clara ignored them all, trudging through the snow toward the flames. She heard the screaming before she saw the camp, or what was left of it. 3 teepees burned against the dawn sky, and bodies lay scattered in the snow like broken dolls. The bounty hunters were still there, 5 men on horseback, rifles held casual and ready. They were laughing. Clara's stomach turned, but she forced herself forward. A woman crawled through the snow, leaving a trail of red behind her. Clara dropped to her knees beside her, already assessing the wound, a bullet through the shoulder, bleeding but not immediately fatal if treated. Well, one of the riders had noticed her. Jake Morrison. She recognized him. A hard man who'd come through the trading post several times, always looking for trouble. If it ain't the lady doctor, come to tend to the savages? I've come to tend to the wounded, Clara said, not looking up from her work. Her hands were steady as she pressed cloth to the wound, though rage made her voice shake. As is my duty, your duty is to your own kind. Woman, my duty is to those who need healing. She looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. All of them. Morrison's face darkened. He swung down from his horse, and Clara tensed, but kept working. The woman under her hands moaned softly. You do well to remember where your loyalties lie, he said, standing over her. These ain't people. They're animals, and they're worth good money dead. Then you're no better than an animal yourself. The words were out before Clara could stop them. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but another voice cut through the tension. Touch her, and you'll answer to me. Nash stood at the edge of the camp, rifle aimed steady at Morrison's chest. He'd appeared as silently as smoke, and his presence changed the very air. The other bounty hunters shifted nervously, hands moving to weapons. Well, if it ain't the ghost himself, Morrison said, but his bravado sounded forced. $50 standing right there. Boys, 5 men, 5 bullets in my rifle, Nash said calmly. Who wants to be first? The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Clara kept her hands on her patient, but every muscle was coiled to move. Then, from the direction of the settlement, more riders appeared, townsfolk drawn by the commotion, including Marshal Bennett, a fair man who'd kept peace in harder situations than this. That's enough, Bennett said. Morrison, you and your men have done your bloody work. Take what bounty you've earned and move on. This woman's interfering with lawful business. Morrison protested. This woman's providing medical care, which last I checked wasn't a crime. Bennett's voice brooked no argument. Everyone stand down, now. Slowly, reluctantly. Weapons were lowered. Morrison spat in the snow near Clara's feet. This ain't over. You've chosen your side. Woman, best remember that. The bounty hunters gathered their grisly trophies. Clara forced herself not to look at what they loaded onto pack horses, and rode off. Only when they were gone did Nash lower his rifle and approach. How many wounded? His voice was tight with controlled fury. 3 that I can see still breathing. Clara was already moving to the next patient, a young boy with burns on his arms. I need clean water, shelter to work in. My camp, Nash said immediately. It's hidden, safe. I'll help carry them. Marshal Bennett stepped forward. Now hold on. Marshal, these people need immediate care or they'll die. Clara interrupted. I'm going to provide it. You can either help or get out of my way. Bennett looked between Clara, Nash, and the wounded Cheyenne. Finally, he sighed. I saw nothing. Understand? Whatever happens here, I saw nothing. It took 2 hours to move the wounded to Nash's camp, a sheltered grove in the foothills where a small cabin sat camouflaged among the trees. Clara worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Nash assisting with steady hands and few words. The woman would live, though she'd never have full use of her arm. The boy's burns were serious, but survivable. The third, an elderly man, died as the sun reached its zenith, despite Clara's best efforts. She sat back on her heels, exhausted and covered in blood. as Nash gently closed the old man's eyes and began singing something low and mournful in his own language. The surviving Cheyenne, 2 women and 3 children who'd hidden during the attack, joined their voices to his, and Clara felt tears run down her cheeks for the senseless waste of it all. When the song ended, Nash touched her shoulder. "You need rest, food. I need to stay with the patients. Red Dove will watch them. She knows healing ways too." He indicated one of the women. "Come." Too tired to argue, Clara let him lead her outside. The sun was setting again, another day ending in blood and sorrow. Nash built a small fire and handed her a cup of something hot, tea made from pine needles and herbs that tasted of resin and earth. "You risked everything today," he said, sitting across from her. "I did what was right. Right and safe rarely travel the same path." He studied her face. Morrison meant his threat. "You've made an enemy." "Then I'm in good company." She met his eyes. "Thank you for coming when you did." "I was tracking them. Heard they were in the area, hunting." His jaw clenched. "I was too late." "You saved who you could. We saved who we could." "We—" He repeated the word softly. "You know what that means, to stand with us? It means I'm a healer who doesn't choose her patients based on the color of their skin. It means more than that now." Nash moved around the fire to sit beside her. "It means you're outside the protection of your people. It means you're as much an enemy to men like Morrison as I am." "Then so be it." He was quiet for a long moment, then reached out to wipe a smudge of soot from her cheek. His touch lingered, and Clara found herself leaning into it. "You have a warrior's heart," he said softly. "But warriors need something to fight for, not just against. What do you fight for?" "I used to fight for revenge, then for survival. Now—" He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Now, I think maybe I fight for the possibility of something better. For moments like that evening by the river. For people like you who see beyond the hatred." Clara turned to face him fully, aware of how close they were, how the firelight danced in his eyes. "Nash, I know," he said. "I know all the reasons this is impossible, but knowing doesn't change what I feel when I look at you." She kissed him then, because words were inadequate for what she felt, grief and hope and desire all tangled together. He made a sound of surprise before his arms came around her, pulling her closer. The kiss was desperate and tender at once, tasting of pine tea and sorrow and something that might have been joy. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Nash rested his forehead against hers. "This is dangerous," he whispered. "Everything worth doing is—" Clara replied. They sat by the fire as darkness fell, not speaking, not needing to. In the cabin, Red Dove sang softly to the wounded. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs. And there, in the space between two worlds, 2 people who had every reason to remain strangers held each other against the cold and the cruelty and the vast indifference of the frontier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Morrison's threats, the settlement's judgment, the ongoing struggle for survival. But tonight, Clara thought, tonight they had this: the warmth of the fire, the shelter of the trees, and the fierce, fragile connection between 2 hearts that refused to let hatred have the final word. In Nash's arms, with the scent of pine and gunpowder still clinging to them both, Clara understood that she had indeed chosen a side, not the side of her people or his, but the side of those who believed that love could bloom even in soil watered with blood. That healing was possible even in the midst of killing, that 2 people could build something worth defending in the space between warring worlds. The fire burned low, and still they sat together, guarding the wounded, guarding each other, guarding the small, stubborn flame of hope that refused to be extinguished. The days after the attack passed in a haze of tension that hung over the settlement like storm clouds. Clara went about her duties at the trading post, but she could feel the shift in how people looked at her, some with disgust, others with a wary respect, most with suspicion. Martha barely spoke to her, communicating in grunts and sharp gestures. It started small. A rancher's wife, who'd been friendly before, now crossed the street to avoid her. The blacksmith refused to fix a broken hinge on her medical bag. Someone left a dead rabbit on her doorstep with a note. Injun lover. Clara burned the note and cooked the rabbit. She'd survived worse than small-minded hatred, but Morrison and his men hadn't left the area as Marshal Bennett ordered. They lingered like vultures, drinking at the saloon, spreading their poison with every whiskey-loosened tongue. Stories grew in the telling. How Clara had stood against her own kind. How she'd been seen sneaking off with that savage Nash. How she was probably sharing more than medical knowledge with the heathens. It was a frigid January morning when things came to a head. Clara was returning from tending to a difficult birth at a homestead outside town when she found a crowd gathered in front of the trading post. Her heart sank as she recognized the ugly mood. She'd seen such crowds before. During the war, when fear and hatred needed a target, Morrison stood at the center, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Bringing disease and danger to our women and children. Bad enough we got savages lurking in the mountains. Now we got their sympathizers right here among us. What's going on here? Clara pushed through the crowd, head high despite the hammering of her heart. The lady herself. Morrison's smile was all teeth and malice. We were just discussing how this settlement doesn't need the kind of doctor who'd rather tend to savages than decent Christian folk. I tend to anyone who needs help, Clara said firmly. That's what doctors do. That's what traders do. He stepped closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. You chose them over us. Well, choices have consequences. The crowd murmured agreement. Faces she'd treated and helped now twisted with mob mentality. Clara felt the first real spike of fear. Now hold on. Marshal Bennett pushed through the crowd. There's no law against providing medical care. There's God's law, someone shouted. And the law of survival. She's been sneaking off to see that redskin Nash, Morrison added, his voice sly. Ask her where she goes when she thinks no one's watching. Heat flooded Clara's face, but she kept her voice steady. Where I go and who I speak with is my business, as long as I break no laws. See? She doesn't deny it. Morrison turned to the crowd. How long before she's leading them right to our doors? How long before our children ain't safe? The crowd's murmur grew uglier. Someone threw a clod of frozen mud that struck Clara's shoulder. Another followed. Then another. Marshal Bennett tried to restore order, but the mob had its own momentum now. Get out! The cry came from multiple throats. We don't want your kind here. Clara stood her ground, even as debris pelted her. I've done nothing but help this community. A stone caught her on the temple, sharp enough to draw blood. The world tilted, and she stumbled. More stones followed, and she raised her arms to protect her face, tasting copper and defeat. Then thunder split the air, not from the clear sky, but from a rifle shot that sent everyone diving for cover. Nash sat on his horse at the edge of the square, rifle pointed skyward, his face carved from stone. The next shot won't be a warning, he said, voice carrying clearly. Anyone else wants to throw stones at an unarmed woman? There he is. Morrison went for his gun, but Nash's rifle swung to point at his chest before he could clear leather. Try it, Nash said softly. Please. The standoff stretched taut. Clara wiped blood from her eyes, seeing the scene as if from a great distance. The mob crouched and ready for violence. Nash alone against them all. Marshal Bennett trying desperately to prevent a massacre. Everyone calm down, Bennett ordered. Nash, lower the weapon. Morrison, step back. He threatened lawful citizens. Morrison protested. After those citizens were stoning an innocent woman. Bennett's voice was steel. Everyone disperse, now, or I'll arrest the lot of you for inciting violence. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to break apart. Morrison held his position longest, hate radiating from every line of his body. This ain't over, he said, not by a long shot. Nash waited until the square was nearly empty before dismounting. He moved to Clara's side, his hands gentle as he examined her head wound. It's not deep, she said, though the world still spun slightly. Deep enough. His jaw was tight with suppressed rage. "Can you ride?" "I can walk. Can you ride?" he repeated. Clara nodded, then regretted it as pain spiked through her skull. Nash whistled, and his paint horse trotted over. He lifted her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. "You're making this worse," Clara said as he guided the horse away from the settlement. "They'll say—" "Let them say what they will. They've already decided what you are to them." His arm around her waist was steady, secure. "The only question now is what you decide for yourself." He took her to a sheltered spot by the river where a natural hot spring had carved a small pool in the rocks. The water steamed in the cold air, and Clara could smell minerals and sage. Nash helped her down, then began gathering items from his saddlebags: clean cloth, a pottery jar of salve, herbs she didn't recognize. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a flat rock by the spring. Clara obeyed, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. Nash knelt before her, cleaning the wound with warm water from the spring. His touch was infinitely gentle, at odds with the warrior who'd faced down an entire mob. "This will sting," he warned. Applying the salve, it did, but the pain was clean. Clearing her head, "Thank you," she said softly. "Again." "You shouldn't thank me. This happened because of me, because of what I am to them." "No." Clara caught his hand. "This happened because of what I chose, and I'd choose it again." Nash looked at her for a long moment, emotions warring in his eyes. "You could leave, go east, back to your own world. Be safe. I left that world for a reason, and safe." She laughed, though it hurt her head. "I've never been interested in safe." He touched her face with reverent fingers. "What are you interested in?" "You," she said simply. The chance to build something new, something that isn't about the past or old hatreds." "Clara," his voice was rough, "you don't understand what you're risking. My people are dying, the old ways are ending. To be with me is to be part of that ending, or part of a new beginning." She leaned into his touch. "Nash, I've already lost everything once, my husband, my home, my purpose. I came west thinking I was running from that loss, but maybe I was running towards something. Toward you." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, and she could taste his fear for her, his desire, his hope that he couldn't quite kill despite everything. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "There's a place," he said quietly, "up in the mountains, a valley hidden from the world. Some of my people have gone there, the ones who won't go to the reservation. We could go build something away from all this. Is that what you want, to hide? I want you alive. I want you away from men like Morrison." His hands clenched. "I want many things I cannot have, but mostly, I want you to have a choice that doesn't end with stones and blood." Clara was quiet, watching steam rise from the hot spring. The sun was setting, painting the snow pink and gold. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the settlement's chimneys, the place that had been her refuge and was now her danger. "I need to go back," she said finally. "Get my things, my medical supplies. Say goodbye to Martha, at least. It's not safe. I won't be driven out like a thief in the night. I'll leave on my own terms." She stood, steadier now. "Will you wait for me?" Nash rose with her. "I'll watch. If there's trouble, there won't be. Morrison's made his point. The town has chosen its side. But I'll make my exit with dignity." He clearly wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he caught her hand, pressing something into her palm, a small carved stone on a leather cord. "Wear this," he said, "so I can find you if we're separated." Clara looked at the stone, a bear, carved with exquisite detail despite its tiny size. "It's beautiful. It was my father's. He gave it to my mother when they married." Nash's voice was soft, for protection and courage. The weight of the gift wasn't lost on Clara. She slipped the cord over her head, the stone warm against her chest. "I'll come to you," she promised. "Tomorrow, after I've set things right." He took her back to the edge of the settlement as full dark fell. This time, Clara didn't protest when he insisted on watching until she was safely inside the trading post. She could feel his presence out there in the darkness, standing guard, and it gave her strength for what was to come. Martha was waiting in the kitchen, her face grim. "So you're leaving?" "You know I have to." The older woman sighed. "Maybe so. Maybe it's for the best. But Clara—" She hesitated, then pulled the younger woman into a rough embrace. "You be careful. The world ain't kind to women who color outside the lines." "I know," Clara said, returning the embrace. "But some things are worth the risk." She spent the night packing carefully. Medical supplies, her few precious books, clothing practical for mountain living. The carved bear rested warm against her skin, a promise and a talisman. Tomorrow, she would leave this place that had become both haven and trap. Tomorrow, she would choose love over safety, hope over fear. Tomorrow, she would step fully into the space between two worlds and see what could be built there. But tonight, she prepared and planned and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Outside, she knew Nash kept watch, and that knowledge wrapped around her like armor. The die was cast. Now, all that remained was to see where it would fall. Clara left the settlement at first light, her packed belongings loaded onto the mule Martha had quietly provided. The streets were empty, but she could feel eyes watching from behind curtains. Let them watch, she thought. Let them see her leave with her head high. Nash met her at the agreed spot, a grove of aspens 2 miles north where the trail forked toward the mountains. He was not alone. 3 Cheyenne families waited with him, their belongings packed on travois, children clutching their mother's hands. Clara recognized Red Dove and the 2 she'd treated after the attack. "They come with us," Nash said simply. "Is this acceptable?" Clara nodded. "Of course. Safety in numbers." The journey into the mountains was harder than she'd imagined. The trail wound upward through forests of pine and fir, sometimes disappearing entirely beneath fresh snow. Nash led them with sure knowledge, finding paths Clara couldn't see, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed snow. They'd been traveling for 3 days when Nash suddenly held up his hand, halting the group. He tilted his head, listening to something Clara couldn't hear. "Riders," he said quietly. "Many, moving fast." Clara's blood chilled as she recognized the danger. "Morrison?" "Hide the families," Nash ordered in Cheyenne. The women quickly guided the children off the trail into a thick stand of evergreens. Nash handed Clara his rifle. "You know how to use this?" "Yes." Thomas had taught her, insisted on it before he left for war. "Good. Find cover. If things go badly, they won't," Clara said firmly, though her hands trembled as she took the weapon. The riders came into view minutes later, Morrison leading 8 men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of those who'd come for blood. They pulled up short, seeing Nash standing alone in the trail. Well, well," Morrison drawled, the ghost himself, and without his white woman to hide behind. "Turn back," Nash said calmly. "You have no business here. Got a paper here says different." Morrison pulled out a document. "Warrant for your arrest, signed by the territorial judge. Seems someone attacked lawful bounty hunters, threatened citizens. That's a hanging offense." Clara knew the warrant was likely forged or obtained through lies, but that wouldn't matter if they took Nash. "And we got word the lady doctor was seen leaving town. Wouldn't be harboring a fugitive, would you?" Morrison's eyes scanned the forest. "That'd make her an accomplice." Nash's hand moved slowly toward his knife. "I said turn back. Last warning. 9 of us. 1 of you. I like those odds." Morrison started to draw his gun. The shot came from Clara's position, striking the ground at Morrison's horse's feet. The animal reared, nearly throwing him. "The next one won't miss," Clara called out, sighting down the rifle barrel. "And before you think about rushing us, know that we're not alone. These woods are full of Cheyenne who've had enough of being hunted." It was a bluff, but Morrison didn't know that. His men looked nervous, scanning the trees for hidden warriors. "Show yourself, woman," Morrison demanded. Clara stepped partially into view, rifle steady. "I'm leaving. Morrison, we're all leaving. Let us go, and this ends here. You think you can just ride off into the sunset with your savage? You think there's any place far enough?" Morrison's voice was ugly with rage. "We'll hunt you to the ends of the earth, you and every red-skinned—" His words cut off as an arrow sprouted from his shoulder. He screamed, clutching at the shaft, and chaos erupted. More arrows flew from the trees, the hidden families defending themselves with hunting bows. Nash moved like lightning, pulling a rider from his horse. Clara fired again, this time aiming to wound, catching another man in the leg. The fight was brief but vicious. Morrison's men, expecting easy prey, found themselves caught in an ambush. Within minutes, 3 were wounded, 1 dead, and the rest were fleeing back down the trail, Morrison cursing and bleeding as he rode. Nash stood breathing hard, a cut on his cheek where a bullet had grazed him. "Is anyone hurt?" he called in Cheyenne. Red Dove emerged from the trees. "No injuries, but they'll be back, with more men. Then we move fast." Nash looked at Clara, who still held the smoking rifle. "You shot well. I shot to protect." She was shaking now, adrenaline leaving her system. "But Red Dove is right. They'll come back." They traveled through the night, pushing hard despite exhaustion. The children rode on the travois, while the adults took turns scouting ahead and behind. By dawn, they'd reached the entrance to a narrow canyon, its walls rising sheer on either side. "Through here," Nash said. "It's the only way to the hidden valley, easy to defend if they follow." The canyon was a slash in the mountain's face, barely wide enough for the travois to pass. They moved in single file, the walls pressing close, blocking out all but a ribbon of sky above. Clara had never felt so trapped, so vulnerable. It took hours to traverse the canyon. Just when Clara thought she couldn't take another step, it opened suddenly into a valley that took her breath away. Surrounded by peaks on all sides, it was a hidden paradise. Grass meadows dotted with wildflowers despite the season. A clear stream running through the center, stands of aspen and pine providing shelter. "How?" Clara breathed. "Hot springs," Nash explained. "They keep the valley warmer than the surrounding mountains. My people have known of this place for generations, a refuge when times were hard. There were already shelters here, a mix of traditional teepees and log cabins, smoke rising from cooking fires. People emerged to greet them, faces wary until they recognized Nash and Red Dove. Then there were embraces, rapid conversation in Cheyenne, children running to play with other children. An elderly man approached, his face deeply lined but his eyes sharp. He spoke at length with Nash, gesturing toward Clara several times. Nash's responses were respectful but firm. "This is Sleeping Bear," Nash told Clara. "He leads here. He says you're welcome, but asks what your intentions are." Clara met the old man's eyes. "My intention is to help where I can, to learn what you're willing to teach, and to build a life with Nash if he'll have me." Sleeping Bear studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He said something that made Nash's eyes widen. "He says you have the spirit of a white buffalo woman, rare and powerful. He says the spirits told him someone like you would come." Nash's voice was wondering. "He offers you a place by his fire, the protection of the people." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. After the rejection of the settlement, this acceptance was overwhelming. "Tell him I'm honored." They were given a small cabin on the edge of the meadow, close enough to the community but with some privacy. As Clara unpacked her medical supplies, Nash stood in the doorway watching her. "You fired on your own people for me," he said quietly. "They stopped being my people when they picked up stones." Clara turned to face him. "You're my people now. This is my home." Nash crossed to her in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "I love you," he said, the words fierce and raw. "I should have said it before. I love you. Clara Matthews. And I love you," she whispered against his chest. "Despite everything. Because of everything." That night, as snow began to fall outside their cabin, They lay together by the fire, skin against skin, hearts beating in rhythm. Nash traced the bruises on her temple from the stones, his touch infinitely gentle. "We're not safe here," he said. "Morrison will tell others. The army might come. Then we'll face that when it happens." Clara kissed him softly. "But tonight, we're here. We're together. We're alive." Outside, the wind sang through the valley, and somewhere a wolf howled, not a threat but a welcome, a recognition of wildness answering wildness. Clara thought of the life she'd left behind, the safety of conformity, the slow death of the soul that came from denying one's heart. She'd chosen danger and love and uncertainty. She'd chosen to stand between two worlds and try to build a bridge. It might all end in disaster. Morrison's threats were real, the forces against them powerful. But lying there in Nash's arms, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the solid reality of him against her, Clara knew she'd make the same choice again. Some things were worth any risk. Some loves were worth any price. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like prayers or wishes or promises. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight, in this hidden valley where spring flowers bloomed in winter, two souls who'd found each other against all odds held tight and let hope warm them more than any flame. The storm was coming, but for now, they had shelter. They had each other. They had this moment of peace carved out of a violent world. And sometimes, Clara thought as sleep finally took her, that was miracle enough. They came on a night when the moon was dark, when clouds covered the stars and snow fell thick and silent. Clara woke to Nash's hand over her mouth, his whisper urgent in her ear. "They're here, many of them. Get dressed, quickly." She could hear it now, horses moving through the canyon, the clink of metal on metal, voices trying to be quiet but carrying in the still air. Her hands shook as she pulled on clothes, grabbed her medical bag and the rifle Nash had given her. "How many?" she whispered. 20, maybe more. Morrison brought friends." Nash was already moving, checking weapons, his face grim in the darkness. "They'll attack at dawn." Outside, the valley was stirring. Silent figures moved between lodges, women and children being guided to the caves in the eastern cliff face, warriors taking positions. It was a dance they'd done before. Clara realized, the dance of the hunted. Sleeping Bear appeared at their cabin, his weathered face calm despite the danger. He spoke rapidly to Nash and Cheyenne, gesturing toward the canyon entrance. "He says to take you to the caves," Nash translated. "With the other women and children." "No." Clara's voice was firm. "I'm needed here. There will be wounded." "Clara, we've had this discussion. I don't hide while others fight for me." She met his eyes steadily. "Partners, remember?" Nash looked like he wanted to argue, but Sleeping Bear placed a hand on his shoulder, spoke quietly. Nash's expression shifted to something like wonder. "He says the spirit spoke true. You are where you should be." He pulled her close, kissed her hard. "Stay behind cover, please." The attack came with the first gray light of dawn. Morrison's men poured through the canyon entrance, expecting to catch the village sleeping. Instead, they met coordinated resistance. Arrows flew from hidden positions, rifles cracked from behind rocks and trees. The narrow canyon mouth became a death trap. Clara worked from a sheltered position near the main fire pit, treating wounded as they were brought to her. An arrow wound here, a bullet grazed there. She moved with practiced efficiency, her world narrowing to blood and bandages and the next patient. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Morrison's men had expected easy prey, not a fortified position defended by people with everything to lose. But they had numbers and ammunition, and slowly, inexorably, they pushed forward into the valley. Clara was binding a deep gash on a young warrior's arm when she heard Nash shout her name. She looked up to see Morrison himself, bloodied but upright, his pistol aimed at her from 20 feet away. "Should have stayed with your own kind, woman," he snarled. Time slowed. Clara saw his finger tighten on the trigger, knew she couldn't move fast enough. Then Nash was there, throwing himself between them, and the shot that was meant for her heart caught him in the chest instead. "No!" Clara screamed, catching him as he fell. Morrison was already aiming again when an arrow took him in the throat. He dropped, gurgling, as Red Dove lowered her bow, her face fierce with satisfaction. But Clara saw none of it. Her world had shrunk to Nash's face, to the spreading crimson on his shirt, to keeping pressure on the wound even as blood seeped between her fingers. "Hold on," she begged. "Just hold on." Around them, the battle was turning, leaderless, facing fiercer resistance than expected. Morrison's men began to retreat. Some fled immediately. Others tried to grab their wounded. The Cheyenne pressed their advantage, driving them back through the canyon. Clara worked desperately over Nash. The bullet had missed his heart but caught a lung. She could hear the wheeze and bubble of air escaping where it shouldn't, see the pale shock setting into his features. "Need to seal the wound," she muttered, looking around frantically. Then she remembered. The hot springs. "Help me," she called to Red Dove. "We need to get him to the hot springs." Together with 2 warriors, they carried Nash to the nearest spring. Clara didn't hesitate. Wading and fully clothed, supporting Nash in the mineral-rich water that steamed in the cold air. "This will hurt," she warned, then pressed a cloth soaked in the hot water against the wound. Nash's body arched, a cry escaping him, but the heat helped cauterize the bleeding vessels. Clara worked with desperate skill, using techniques she'd learned in field hospitals, adaptations she'd made for frontier medicine. Time blurred, the sun climbed higher, the sounds of battle faded to distant shouts and then silence. Still Clara worked, cleaning the wound, packing it with herbs Red Dove provided, binding it tight. Nash drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing labored but steady. "The battle?" he asked during one lucid moment. "We won," Sleeping Bear said from the spring's edge. "They run like rabbits, lost 6 men, including their leader. They will not come back." But the victory felt hollow to Clara as she watched Nash fight for each breath. She'd seen too many men die from such wounds, even with the best care. "You stay with me," she told him fiercely. "You hear me? You don't get to save my life and then leave me." Nash's hand found hers under the water. "Stubborn woman," he whispered. "That's why you love me." "One of many reasons." They stayed in the spring until Nash's skin was pruned and the wound had stopped seeping. Then, carefully, they moved him back to their cabin. Clara didn't leave his side for 3 days, monitoring his breathing, fighting the fever that tried to claim him, pouring her will into keeping him anchored to life. On the 4th day, she woke from an exhausted doze to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time since the shooting. "You look terrible," he said, voice rough but tinged with humor. Clara burst into tears, relief, exhaustion, and love, all overwhelming her at once. "You're a fool," she sobbed. "A brave, wonderful fool." "You're a fool," he corrected, reaching up to wipe her tears. The recovery was slow. Winter pressed in around the valley, sealing them off from the outside world. Clara threw herself into learning everything she could about Cheyenne medicine, combining it with her own knowledge. She delivered babies, set bones, treated everything from frostbite to pneumonia, earning her place in the community through skill and dedication. Nash grew stronger gradually, the wound healing clean though it left him with a permanent wheeze, a reminder of the price paid for love. They were married in a ceremony that blended traditions, Sleeping Bear presiding in Cheyenne custom, while Clara spoke vows she'd learned from the Book of Common Prayer. The entire valley celebrated, understanding that this union represented more than just 2 people. It was a bridge between worlds, a hope for something new. Spring came early to the hidden valley, as it always did. Clara stood at the entrance to their cabin, watching Nash work with the young men, teaching them to hunt despite his weakened lung. Her hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where new life grew, a child of 2 worlds, a future neither purely white nor purely Cheyenne, but something uniquely its own. Red Dove approached, carrying a bundle of fresh herbs. "The scouts report no movement in the lowlands," she said. "The white soldiers have not come. Perhaps they will not." "Perhaps," Clara agreed, though she knew better than to fully believe it. The outside world hadn't forgotten them. It was simply occupied with other matters. The reprieve wouldn't last forever, but for now, they had this safety, community, love. They had survived the crucible and emerged scarred but whole. In the hidden valley where spring came early and two peoples tried to forge one future. Clara had found what she'd come west seeking without knowing it. Not escape from her past, but a reason to face the future. Nash joined her, his arm settling around her waist, his hand covering hers on her belly. "No regrets?" he asked, as he did sometimes. "None," Clara said firmly. "Not one." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, the valley settled into evening peace. Children played between the lodges, mixing Cheyenne and English in their games. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the scent of stew and fry bread. It was a small world, a fragile world, but it was theirs. The fight wasn't over, might never be truly over, but they'd won this battle, carved out this space, proved that love could survive even in a landscape poisoned by hate. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again over their hidden valley, they'd continue building something new from the ashes of two broken worlds. For now, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The child came with the first light of summer dawn, as the valley bloomed with wildflowers and the air smelled of sage and possibility. Clara labored through the night with Red Dove attending her, Nash pacing outside like a caged mountain cat. When the baby's cry finally pierced the morning air, it seemed to Clara that the very mountains echoed with joy. "A daughter," Red Dove announced, placing the squirming bundle in Clara's arms. "Strong and fierce, like her mother." Nash entered tentatively, his warrior's confidence deserting him in the face of this tiny miracle. When Clara placed their daughter in his arms, his eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "She's perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's copper skin, her dark hair, her blue eyes that would likely darken with time. "What shall we name her?" "Hope," Clara said without hesitation. "Hope, Sarah Singingbird, for what she represents, for my mother, and for your people's traditions." The valley embraced the child as their own. She was passed from arm to arm, blessed by Sleeping Bear, sung to in Cheyenne lullabies and English hymns. In her, the community saw their future, not Cheyenne or white, but something new, something that might survive in the changing world. As spring turned to summer, news trickled in from the outside world. The Indian wars were winding down, forced relocations nearly complete. The frontier was being carved up by railroads and settlers, the old ways disappearing like snow in spring. But here in their hidden valley, protected by mountains and secrecy, life continued. Clara had become the valley's primary healer, blending her medical knowledge with traditional practices. Nash, despite his injured lung, led hunting parties and taught the young men both old skills and new strategies for survival. Together, they were building something unprecedented, a community where both cultures were valued, where children learned to read from Clara's precious books and to track from the elders, where Christmas and traditional ceremonies were celebrated with equal reverence. One evening, as they sat by their cabin watching Hope toddle between them on unsteady legs, Nash pointed to the ridge above the valley. A lone figure stood silhouetted against the sunset. A rider, watching. Clara tensed, but Nash placed a calming hand on her arm. Not an enemy, a messenger, perhaps, or someone seeking sanctuary. The rider descended slowly, and as he drew closer, Clara recognized him with shock. Marshal Bennett from the settlement, older now, his badge gone, his face weathered by hard years. "Marshal?" Clara stood, uncertain. "How did you find us?" Bennett dismounted stiffly. "Wasn't easy. Took me near 2 years of following rumors and whispers." He looked between them, at Hope playing in the grass. "I'm not here as the law. That life's behind me. I'm here because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Because you were right. What happened that day, with Morrison and the mob, it opened my eyes, made me see what we'd become. Nash remained watchful, but gestured for Bennett to sit. They shared water, watched the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. The settlements changed. Bennett continued. Grown bigger, meaner, railroads coming through next year. Most of the old-timers have moved on or been pushed out. Martha Garrison died last winter. Left a letter for you, Clara. Said to tell you she was proud of the stand you took. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Despite everything, Martha had been a friend. Why are you really here? Nash asked directly. Bennett met his gaze. Because I'm tired of living in a world divided by hate. Because I want to spend my remaining years doing something worthwhile. I hear you've built something different here. Thought maybe you could use another pair of hands, even old ones. Sleeping Bear, who had approached silently, studied Bennett with ancient eyes. Finally, he nodded. A man who can change his heart can change his path. You may stay, learn our ways, but you must leave your old world truly behind. And so their community grew by one more, an unlikely addition, but one that proved valuable. Bennett's knowledge of the outside world helped them navigate the changing legal landscape. File the right papers to protect their valley through obscure treaties and land claims. Years passed. Hope grew strong and bright, equally at home in buckskins or calico. Speaking Cheyenne and English with matching fluency, more children followed. A son they named Thomas Yellowhawk. Twins called Mary Dawn and Samuel Sky. The valley became a refuge for others like them. Mixed families. Those who didn't fit in either world. Those seeking a place where differences were strengths rather than divisions. Clara stood on the same ridge where she'd first seen the valley. Now, with silver threading through her hair and laugh lines mapping years of joy and sorrow on her face. Nash stood beside her, still strong despite the wheeze that never left him, their children playing in the meadow below. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed in St. Louis? Nash asked. Lived the life expected of you? Clara considered the question, though the answer came immediately. I would have died, she said simply. Not my body, perhaps, but my spirit. Everything that matters to me, you, our children. This life we've built, none of it would exist. No regrets. It was their old ritual, but the answer was always the same. None, not one. The sun was setting, painting their hidden valley in shades of gold and rose. Smoke rose from cook fires. Voices lifted in laughter and song. Cheyenne and English mingling like streams joining to form a river. It wasn't perfect. The outside world still pressed at their borders, threatened their peace. But they'd proven something important, that love could bridge any divide, that people could choose unity over division, that from the ashes of two broken worlds, something new and beautiful could grow. As they walked back down to their cabin, hand in hand. Clara thought of that long-ago storm when Nash had first warned her to get inside before it was too late. She'd thought he meant the dust storm, but now she understood. He'd been warning her about the storm of hate and violence that threatened to consume them all. And she had gotten inside, not into shelter from the storm, but into his heart, his world, where together they'd weathered every tempest. Hope ran to meet them, her face bright with innocent joy, her very existence a defiance of those who said such love was impossible. Clara swept her daughter into her arms, Nash's arm around them both, and knew that every choice, every risk, every moment of fear had been worth it for this family, this home, this proof that love was stronger than hate. The stars were coming out, bright and eternal above their valley. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, as all tomorrows did. But tonight, they were together, they were whole, and they were home. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for listening to this story of love and courage in the Wild West. I'm curious to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share your location in the comments so we can connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Clara and Nash's journey. Your comments and perspectives make these stories come alive in new ways.